Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Ryan Cooper. Just doing a solo intro for our episode today. Alexi will be with us in a moment, but we are interviewing the historian David Austin Walsh about his book, Taking America Back, the Conservative Movement and the Far Right. But also, we wanted to have him on to discuss his bad tweets that he did that he's very sorry about, but more importantly, the fact that those bad tweets led him to be offered a bunch of opportunities from some of the worst scumbags in right-wing media like Chris Rufo, Fox News, The Wall Street Journal. The conversation went long, and so we're going to split this into two episodes. The first one will be primarily about the controversy and what it reveals about the structure of the conservative movement at the moment, and the second episode, which we'll put out next week, will be more about the book. And that one will be a bonus episode, so if you like the first half, feel free to subscribe. Anyways, briefly, before we get to the interview, I need to mention that this podcast is sponsored by the American Prospect magazine. So if you subscribe at $10 a month, you will get a free digital subscription to the website, as well as a discounted print subscription should you want it, as well as our bonus episodes, of course. Subscribe at $5 a month to get just the bonus episodes, or just enjoy the free stuff if you so wish. Otherwise, rate, review us on Apple Podcasts if you like. And without wasting any more time, let's get to our interview with David Walsh right now. Welcome to the show, David Austin Walsh. You've recently written a book. It's called Taking America Back, the Conservative Movement and the Far Right. And we wanted to have you on not only to talk about that, but of course, you know, if anybody has been online, you know, there's been some drama around David, alas. And I think, you know, normally this isn't really a Twitter arguments recap podcast. But I think it's a pretty valuable thing. It's a very interesting, you know, what happened. I think to start with, we need to address kind of the bad tweets that sparked off the whole thing. You know, the one that was going around, you wrote, I'm 35 years old.
You're going to read them to be verbatim. This is wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. But, you know, I feel like we should face it head on, you know?
Yeah.
I'm 35 years old. I'm 4+ years post PhD. And quite frankly, I'm also a white dude. Combine those factors together and I'm, for all intents and purposes, unemployable as a 20th century American historian. And, you know, you later like took that back and apologized. But I think, you know, it is, you know, first of all, like worth exploring, like what the actual problems here are, you know, what you're talking about. And, you know, the tweet comes off as if, you know, kind of an entitled privilege, like, I deserve a job and I should get it. And maybe an implication that like black people are keeping me out, which I don't think, you know, you said later is not at all what you were trying to say. So, you know, talk a little bit about, I guess, the sort of the crisis in higher ed, and specifically the crisis in the humanities, and specifically the crisis in the history profession.
Right.
In this country.
Well, first of all, let me say this right off the bat. It is never a good idea, and this only underlines it, to have obviously a mental health episode in full view of you know, the Twitter public. You know, I was in a bad place when I wrote that thread. You know, I very sincerely meant what I said in my apology. That, you know, there were many things wrong with it. You know, I think the most fundamental is that it was a breach of solidarity with people who are going through exactly the same thing and are frankly dealing with it a lot better than I am. But yeah, so taking a step back, and also the way that I framed it as an incredibly sort of arrogant and self-entitled thing. But taking a step back, what's been happening in higher ed, in the humanities in particular, so it's not just in history, it's in other departments, it's in English, it's in literature, is that since the Great Recession, so we're talking 15 years ago now, over 15 years ago now, the job market for PhDs in higher education, for, you know, tenure track jobs, has basically collapsed. There's a surplus of PhDs on the market. There's not enough jobs. And the disciplines themselves are beginning to pretty aggressively shrink as enrollments plummet and the faculty aren't being replaced. So that's the sort of context before 2020. What happened in 2020, which is when I defended my PhD and first went on the job market, is COVID. So what happened there is that COVID caused what was left of faculty hiring in history and the humanities to freeze. I remember this actually. There were jobs that I'd applied for that that were no longer going to be filled because of the hiring freezes from the pandemic. And that's basically been the case since. There's only a handful of jobs that are on the market every year. Most tenure lines are not being replaced. You're seeing the outright contraction of history as a discipline. What's also happening, though, and again, I saw this in sort of real time over the past several years while I've been on the market, is that in history, there are a handful of jobs that have managed to get past university administrations, which are, who otherwise were totally uninterested in hiring in history and the humanities. And in general, and it was Matt Karp, who's a professor at Princeton, who actually tweeted this out last year. In general, those lines have been in race and ethnicity studies, sort of broadly defined. So African American history, Latinx history, et cetera. The number of jobs in those fields actually, and this should be sort of highlighted, this should be emphasized, has actually likewise collapsed since 2008. So there are less jobs even in these specific fields than there were 15 years ago. But what was distinctive after the George Floyd uprisings and the sort of universities scrambling to essentially they were in cover their ass modes for years, is that they were hiring in these lines, partly because of the shifts in the scholarship, but mostly, I think, because it fulfilled sort of DEI commitments by the universities. So that's the sort of context. I mean, and what I tried to make clear in both the apology thread and also in my response to Richard Hanania, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and I made that public. I actually think that this is a good thing, right? It is good that these jobs are they're being posted. It's good that there are. I mean, we can talk. I'll talk in a little bit more detail in just a moment about the actual commitment.
Just real quick, David, can you explain what DEI is for those who aren't familiar with the acronym?
I would imagine that everybody's familiar with it by now, but it's diversity, equity, inclusion. And so obviously this is building on language from anti-racist activists over the past 15 years. But after the George Floyd uprisings, not just universities, but, corporate America went long on DEI initiatives in response to, longstanding patterns of systemic racism. So that's sort of the basis for, and so what So this is, for obvious reasons, very much a sort of third rail, and we saw that in the sort of response to the thread, the third rail in higher ed politics. In no small part because there was that reporting in the Times last year, 2 years ago, sort of about the origins of DEI as an initiative, as a legal initiative in the University of California system, and it was essentially the tenor of it was that, because in California they banned affirmative action, DEI was basically a way to continue to practice affirmative action, do affirmative action hires without legally calling it that. So it was a sort of workaround solution, because without an affirmative action framework, particularly in the STEM fields and in the professional legal programs, et cetera, there was just no hiring of it was still overwhelmingly white men who were getting hired or in these areas. So I'm sorry, I'm going off in
No, so I think, David, part of what your original tweet was trying to do in a short space with the frustration and anger that you were rightly feeling, because capitalism sucks, and this is a particular manifestation that affects you directly of how it sucks. But you were trying to express how the conjunction of the neoliberal destruction of higher education and all the things you described already has conjoined in time with when you graduated and had your dissertation defended and everything, with the rise of DEI, such that the only types of jobs that seem to be possible within your profession, within history, are jobs that you cannot qualify for, right? And people, of course, as we'll see with Rufo and whatnot, can appropriate that descriptive logic to pernicious and reactionary ends, right? But the point you were trying to make is that, like, and this is an interesting, I think, point to discuss different kinds of privilege. Our friend Dave Kaib has a great distinction between two types of privilege. The type that no one should have, which is the domineering, violent type that is just bad in every instance, and the type that is something good, but partially limited to certain people, right? So the privilege of having water, a job, this, that, and the other. And those privileges are not bad. It's good for those people to have those goods. It's just that it's insufficient because it's not expanded to everyone. If I may, I think what you're in part wanting to make clear, at least initially, is that, like, it's not bad. In fact, it's quite good that people have been denied positions in an industry like academia are given access that they previously were denied. In fact, anyone who gets a job, it's good in this particular industry, especially. But that doesn't mean that there isn't this pernicious problem that you're feeling kind of the brunt of, right?
Well, yes. And there's something else to this too. A colleague wrote to me after the thread went viral, and he said basically, well, it was racist what you said, because being a white guy was working for you at a sort of systemic level until facing this specific sort of obstacle at the point of hire. And he's absolutely right about that. But I'd actually take it a little bit further, and I think this also helps to explain some of. I mean, I do think. I
don't know, David. I don't think we know that white supremacy has helped you in particular. I think systemic analysis doesn't mean that every individual necessarily is benefited in particular. So that's a bit
fair enough. But anyway,
that's a bit liberal of a understanding of racism for my taste. But
I mean, it's kind of ironic too, because it was coming from a Marxist who told me this. But anyway, so but I'd add to that the other issue here, and so I did think I do think that the reaction to the thread was I certainly understand why it upset so many people, and I deeply regret it. I do think that the reaction, and I said this to Hanania, and we'll get into this in a minute, was excessive. I've been reflecting on why it did spark the reaction it did, especially because I've said similar things, maybe a little bit less pointedly and a little bit less sort of self-pityingly in the past. This is not a new sort of observation or conversation. But what I think is distinct in this moment is, I mean, we have seen a pretty sustained commitment to DEI hiring in history and humanities over the past 3 or 4 years. However, universities still treat faculty of color like absolute shit. And so, you have this, theoretical commitment to diversifying the faculty that it does not actually have any real follow-on institutionally. It's just at the point of hire. It is, in essence, just and you can even kind of extend the argument a little bit further because of the collapse of the humanities across the board. It does seem like, and because of the lack of concomitant commitment to diversifying faculty in business schools or in law programs or in medical schools, or for that matter, in STEM fields, which are the sort of heart of the mission of the university. It's where the power is. It's where the money is. It's where the professional status is. It does almost seem as if, as far as universities strategically are concerned, the role of the humanities is to provide a kind of veneer of diversity, so that the fundamental functioning of the university can continue essentially unimpeded. And this has really been thrown into focus, quite frankly, over the past month, because you have these brutal crackdowns on student protesters and faculty who are coming from these disciplines, many of whom are faculty of color, students of color. With, radical politics or some degree of radical politics, given the systemic claims of the protests. And again, the response has been just crush them. So it is, this has sort of been an object lesson, in just on that alone about, the real commitment and to the real strategic vision of the modern American university. And so everybody's fucking miserable. People who are on the market, people who have jobs. It fucking sucks. I can swear on this podcast, right?
Yeah. We're a cursing friendly podcast.
Yeah. I want to get to Rufo and whatnot, but there's one other point I want to make, that regarding the sort of neoliberalization of the university. As you alluded, David, I think that most, if not all, in the case of many institutions, of the motivation behind hiring scholars of color to study the history of race in the United States is like just cynical. It's an ass covering measure, like the worst kind of corporate DEI training, where the whole point is to prevent you from being sued, or as a legal defense in case you get sued for being racist. They don't care about.
And this is, I'd add that this is the really, really frustrating thing too, because the Black Studies, AFAM history in particular, has been, I think, pretty indisputably the most dynamic and interesting sort of branch of American historiography over the past 10 or 15 years. Not everybody has been brilliant. Ibram Kendi recently imploded, which, there was stuff going on there. But, it really, really has been the center of sort of American historiography. And so it is frustrating to see that, it's not just because the dynamism, it is because of the sort of CYA stuff from university administrations that they're investing in this. It's not really a commitment to the scholarship.
Yeah. And so it is, as we've said, like a good thing to see scholars of color getting, tenure track jobs. But I highly question the future possibilities of that commitment being sustained over time. As we've seen, if insofar as this was basically just a sort of scrambling, reaction to George Floyd protests, or a sort of like business MBA mindset of just following the market, there's no conception of like, we have a history department, so we should study like all the major branches of history. Instead, it's just like, scrambling around to do that, sort of like language departments after 9/11. They're like, oh God, only 9 people in the country speak Farsi, like let's hire some people. And yeah, so I think, we saw, what's her name? Claudine Gay, first Black president of Harvard. She was just basically hounded out of her job by a flagrantly racist attack from Chris Rufo. Mm-hmm. And I think that political pressure is going to push universities to radically scale back the African American history stuff. There's going to be much less pressure for it. And in fact, I would guess, I may be wrong, I hope I'm wrong, but I would guess that a lot of institutions will just throw that over the side entirely as basically trying to defend themselves from conservative attack.
I think I hope it's not right, but I think that's probably right. And that's also one of the reasons why the reaction to my thread, and again, bearing in mind that it was legitimate, but why the reaction was so extreme is because it's not 2022 anymore. It's not 2022 anymore. There is a very, very real, very, very racist backlash to DEI that is really central to political discourse today, and it's like it's claimed victories. The sacking of Claudine Gay was a real victory for Christopher Rufo and the forces of reaction. And I think we've also seen the degree. The Bill Ackman stuff. He's been very, very, very public and surprisingly transparent about just what is motivating his sort of political project. And yeah, some of it is, I do take him at his word when he claims to be, concerned about anti-Semitism on campus. But really, when you read his tweets, the main grievance, the main project, and this is not new, by the way, this has been, a motivating factor behind conservative philanthropy in higher education dating back to at least the 1960s. The Allen Foundation, William Allen, oh God, I'm forgetting his first name. But he was, one of the major conservative donors of the past half century. His foundation gave tons. He's one of the reasons why law and economics is an established discipline at most elite law schools. He made all of his money as an arms manufacturer in World War II. He started donating to sort of conservative causes on college campuses because of the student uprising at Cornell in 1969, when the Black Student Union was sort of established and they occupied some campus buildings. So this is not a new phenomenon, but with Ackerman and really what has the dynamics of a capital strike, not just on one campus, but across higher education writ large. I have to imagine, Ryan, that unfortunately you're right, that, university administrators are taking notice of this, and going to be acting accordingly. And it's a catastrophe. But one of the things, and I know we want to pivot to the, Rufo and Beatty, and I actually just got an email this morning. I'm still getting death threats, from a guy with a Finnish name saying, I just wanted you to know that not a single anti-white will be forgiven now that the times are turning. Those of you who are white will suffer the most, especially those aiding in Jewish subversion. So really getting into day of the rope fantasies here. But that's, they feel the wind at their sails.
Yeah. And so this, I think, now that we've sort of set it up, I think the most interesting part of this whole, kerfluffle and why I think ultimately it may be a positive thing that it happened is that they tried to recruit you. Rufo, that's Wall Street Journal, right? Fox News, Richard Hanania, all these degenerate freaks. They saw an opportunity. They were like,
Bogasian did too. I didn't mention that publicly, but Peter Bogasian,
oh God,
what's it? James Lindsay's buddy. He invited me onto his podcast, and I actually thought about going on, essentially to have the conversation that we're having now, because he's got 20 million YouTube subscribers who just want to hear red meat racism. But yeah, no, I'm sorry, Ryan, I interrupted.
No. Well, I was just going to ask, what did they say? What was the pitch? What were they trying to get you to do?
So Hanania reached out to me first. Basically, Rufo's email, which I'll pull up here, just remains the most transparent, sort of recruitment pitch. He wrote to me, there is a redemption arc available to you. Tell the truth about DEI and academic corruption. The answer is not to grovel harder. Self-abasement is repellent to all factions, but to take a courageous stand against the institutions that have gone astray. Everyone knows that you would have easily earned a faculty position even 10 years ago, but the powers that be are pushing through underqualified race and gender scholars in all of the humanities departments. Your professional path as the white male ally has reached the terminus. Why not tell the truth? Which, it's like from fucking Mephistopheles. There is something almost Faustian about this. The redemption arc in particular, I've been sitting with that, and Rufo incident. His pitch was much less explicitly, it still was racist, but much less explicitly committed to white supremacy than Darren Beatty, who also reached out to me. He was one of Rufo's sidekicks, and essentially said the same thing, but was more pointed about low IQ people who are, racially inferior, that sort of thing. So the basic dynamic that I think was happening there, and it's ironic because Rufo, a couple of things here. One is that this is not the first time that Rufo and I and some of these guys have interacted, not through DMs or direct emails, but they know who I am because I work on far right studies stuff. I've tangled with Rufo before. I think, frankly, that I've flattered his ego in the past because I've called him, because I think it's true, one of the most effective right-wing activists in America today, and certainly one of the most dangerous. And so I don't know precisely what they thought I would say to their attempts to sort of recruit me to the right-wing grievance grift. But I do think that there is there's a couple of lessons here. One is that there really is a sort of sustained infrastructure. Again, this is not a new or unique insight, but there really is a sustained infrastructure for, right-wing culture warriors. There's money in it. It's actually a fairly lucrative career path. I remember when I got the email from James Taranto, who's the editor-in-chief of not editor-in-chief, but he's the head of the editorial page at the Wall Street Journal, and he sent me an email inviting me to, wondering if you might like to write a piece on the discrimination you've faced looking for a job in academia. I'll be looking for 800 to 1,000 words. And when I got that email, I'm like, oh shit. like this, they are actually dangling that career in front of me. They're like essentially
they're taking advantage, David. They're taking advantage of your precarity and tempting you with the money you could make by turning to the dark side. They're saying, we know you need the money. You need the money. Come on.
And that's the thing. I mean, like the Rufo's sort of emphasis on the redemption.
Look how well Taibbi is doing.
But that's the thing. I mean, like, so what I think is happening here is that on the one hand, they're dangling the money in front of people who are, subject to Twitter pile-ons or, quote unquote, being canceled or whatever. And they're also feeding the ego as well, because they're saying, I mean, essentially the pitch is, you're not wrong. You're right. You're being pillared for it. Why not, come to the light? And again, the redemptive arc. One of the things that Rufo is very, very good at is understanding how narratives work. And one of the things, so to pivot to the book slightly, I write about, William F. Buckley's relationship in a fair amount of detail with George Lincoln Rockwell, who's becomes the head of the American Nazi Party. He and Buckley used to work for Buckley at National Review in the late 1950s. I mentioned this to a friend of mine the other day, after rereading some of these emails. The way that these guys are writing to me, Hanania, Rufo, and Beatty in particular, is almost identical to the way that Rockwell used to write to William F. Buckley, basically saying, I know, Bill, that you agree with me about like race and white supremacy and the need for, basically fascism in America, but you're not, you can't say that publicly because you'll lose sort of respectability politics and your liberal Jewish friends won't want to talk to you anymore. But, we're on the same side and we know it. So I think for these guys, they love the idea of, I mean, this is the other thing too, because I mean, this is true for conservatives writ large, but I think it's especially true for people on the far right. There's a sort of assumption that, liberals and leftists do basically know that they're right, but for a variety of reasons, we're not capable of admitting that. And so
we don't have the virtues. You notice in their writing to you, you just have to have the moral courage. And
yeah,
the
exactly.
Kind of, you know what I mean? You're being gutless. Just, have the right arete, and then you can, you know the truth. Now you just need to enact it with the right courage, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, and that is a very, powerful pitch to people who are, in especially egotistical people. And I'm nothing if not egotistical, as I think I've proven to everybody, unfortunately. That is on very much my to-do list of self-improvement for the next 6 months, or really probably for the rest of my life. But, I mean, it's a very sort of politically seductive message. The problem is not you. You didn't do anything wrong. You have this sort of redemption arc, and we're willing to welcome you with open arms. And then, of course, they can use that to point. I mean, this is exactly what people did with Taibbi, right? And there are many, many other people who've sort of gone down this road. It's like, well, you have this leftist guy who, now is willing, like the fact it's the conversion narrative. It's, and it's all the more powerful for, turning, somebody who is adamantly your sort of political enemy into now your sort of close political ally. And that's been a very, very powerful dynamic, on the right. I mean, really since Me Too, because, there were so many guys on the left who, were like, are shitty people who are, like serial sexual harassers. I also keep thinking about, you both remember, probably the whole Joshua Katz saga at Princeton. He was the guy who I think he was in the classics department. And he ended up getting fired. I think the official reason was because he kept having sex with his students. There were other dynamics going on there too. One of his now current wife is one of his former students, Solveig Gold, and they had a bunch of profiles written about them in the New York Times, as sort of like, the first couple of cancel culture. And Solveig Gold said something, to the Times reporter, which has stuck with me over the years. It's that, us canceled people look out for each other. So there is just this entire
comrades.
Again, I mean,
comrades.
And you look at people like Thomas Chatterton Williams. I mean, there is just this network of of people on the right with access to real institutional and financial resources. I mean, it's the University of Austin crowd. It's the intellectual dark. It's all of this stuff. And yeah, they like the conversion narratives. And that's sort of the dynamic. I mean, I think in my case, one, because, and again, as I said, like I was unhappy with and continue to be unhappy with the tone of much of the pile on. But I do understand where it came from, and I am genuinely regretful. And
you're unhappy with the economic situation that you're in through no fault of your own. And here's where I want to transition to your book in another way, if you don't mind, right? Yeah. I think there's, besides the recruitment success, and they're obviously very eager and hardworking recruiters, there is obviously rhetorical success that they have writ large with groups of disaffected people. And I think we could talk about it with respect to your book and the conflation that you talk about that the right does between communism, socialism, and New Deal liberalism, right? And we see this on Fox News. We've seen this forever, right? Everyone's a communist. Obama's a communist. Everyone's a communist. And here's the interesting move that I think, this is why I think it works, right? Because part of the problem you were identifying, there's all kinds of problems that liberal capitalism entails. I mean, Jon Stewart, of all people, who's, the comedian, who's not very radical, was on Fareed Zakaria, of all shows, talking about DEI and how actually the problem is that it's just a gesture, but doesn't address any of the systemic racism that is actually the problem. And similarly to how when you look at like when Obamacare was passed, the right jumped on, only half of the country supports it. Well, that's because of the other half of them said it was insufficient and they wanted single payer. And so that conflation move, which says, here's a problem, and is probably caused by capitalism and economic liberalism. And the answer is over here on the right. We're going to pretend that the left's critique doesn't exist at all, and we're going to conflate it with the thing that's actually causing the problem, right? And I think that truth, there is a truth there in the critique of a kind of problem in the economy. And we've had all kinds of, write-ups about Trump and disaffected people and all these Rust Belt states and all that. There's something going on there that allows, I think, the Rufos of the world to succeed because they're doing this move, this misdirection move that is part of that conflation you talk about in the book. So I don't know.
Yeah, no. Actually, to build on that point, it's not really. We can talk more about the book maybe in a bit, but this is on contemporary politics. I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about just in the past couple of weeks has been Trump's, obviously, the race has been shaken up by his, he's now a convicted felon. We can now call him convicted felon Donald Trump and not be afraid of getting sued for libel. It's really, it's the second, it's even better than when OJ died and you could finally say in print he murdered those people. But there was that rally in the Bronx a couple of weeks ago, and all of the reporting, I knew a couple of people who went there out of sort of morbid curiosity, and it did seem like there was it's important not to overemphasize this, but it does sort of underline that some of the polling that's shown this is probably based in has some substance. The sort of beginnings of a apparently genuine multi-ethnic coalition, multiracial coalition, mostly involving young men, to support, who's essentially a Nazi, white supremacist, whatever you want to call Donald Trump, certainly has outside support from the white supremacist faction of the American right. And one of the things that I've also been thinking about, because I'm supposed to go to a conference next week, and I'm on a panel about sort of like the history or the future of right-wing studies in America. The gender component is absolutely critical here. And so you do have this phenomenon of young men who are, and there are complicated causes, right? Because, there's been all of the discussion about the growing gap between college educated and non-college educated voters, especially among men. And you see that across every sort of racial demographic, and that's tied in part to shifting economic opportunities. It's also tied to growing cultural resentment, right? And this is something that, to go back to the whole recruitment thing, like, a lot of people, I know people like this are, mainlining Joe Rogan, mainlining guys like Bagassian, and just sort of getting this sort of toxic. I mean, you know, the sort of the joke now is that, you know, most podcasts, the most popular podcasts, not this one, though we all are dudes, are just like three dudes sitting around complaining about women, basically. And that's you know, and that's, so there's a cultural, you know, shift as well. And yeah, it's hard to know what to do about that. But that certainly is, I think, tied into, you know, it's an accelerant to the sort of broad, structural factors around capitalism, Alexios, that you're sort of referring to there. As for the book, I mean, to go back to the, you know, socialism, communism, liberalism, I mean, that's kind of it. By framing, I mean, you know, what has held the American right together at a very, very basic level since the 1930s is, you know, this almost like Carl Schmittian sense of common enemies. And your common enemies are all basically the same people. They're communists, they're liberals, they're socialists. You know, one of the major themes of the book, and this is one of the reasons why I've been very frustrated by the national conversation about anti-Semitism over the past 6 months since 10/7. One of the major sort of congealers of that, you know, broader sense of resentment, at least until the 1970s and 80s, although there are elements of that to this day, is anti-Semitism. So it's, you know, the outsiders, these, you know, Jewish socialists, Jewish communists, Jewish liberals, who are sort of acting as a stand-in for, the enemies for the authentic American.
I mean, Trump just blamed Soros for his conviction, right?
I didn't see that, but I'm not surprised. I mean, that's
a Soros-backed DA or judge or whatever. Like he was, you know, basically saying that the political forces of the Jewish left corrupted the judicial process for him.
Well, that's a really, really actually important point because, you know, again, one of the reasons why I have been frustrated by the conversations about anti-Semitism in this country over the past since 10/7 is that, I mean, yeah, obviously there's anti-Semitism on the left. Nobody in their right mind would deny that. I don't think that it's the driving dynamic behind, you know, the protest movements. That's clearly like, hey, murdering civilians indiscriminately is bad. That's been very, very explicit, for the vast majority of protesters. But you know, there is a sort of left anti-Semitic political tradition that can be tapped into at various times. You see this in the Soviet Union, et cetera. But it's very distinct from right-wing anti-Semitism, which has its own political history, its own sort of set of tropes and political traditions. And, you know, the Soros stuff is just like, it's that. Like that is what right-wing anti-Semitism has looked like historically. It's what it looks like contemporaneously. It gets complicated because even the Netanyahu family has like indulged in this stuff. So it scrambles a lot of people's perception. Yeah.
And you write it interestingly. I learned a lot about why the conspiracy theories today that involve anti-Semitism and immigration, anti-immigrant xenophobia and hatred. I mean, they have their roots in the far right going back all the way, right? Like it's so maybe talk about that a little because that's a very interesting connection.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's two different dynamics there. There's the phantasmagorical and then there's the actual sort of concrete political analysis. So the phantasmagorical sort of anti-immigrant anti-Semitism, is based, I mean, it is essentially based on, you know, what is identifiably the precursors to great replacement theory today. So this idea that, you know, global elites, which does in and of itself has sort of this anti-Semitic valence, are conspiring to, you know, import people from the third world to destroy the white race in Europe and North America. You know, as early as the 1920s, I mean, this is the explicit basis for the 1924 Immigration Act. You know, which set up racial quota system for immigration into the United States to keep people from Southern Europe. So I guess that would be people like you, Alexios, and also me. You know, my family's Italian, as well as Eastern European Jews from entering the country. One of the architects of that act was a guy named John B. Trevor, who I don't really write about extensively in the book, but it's relevant. He's relevant for this purpose because John B. Trevor was in World War I an Army intelligence officer. And he was actually one of the people who helped to popularize the protocols of the Elders of Zion in this country. So it's the anti-Semitic, you know, forgery produced by the Tsarist government in 1903, claiming that there's this Jewish plot to enslave humanity. That comes to this country, it comes to the West in general because of the Russian Civil War. So you have American soldiers, British soldiers, Allied soldiers fighting against the Bolsheviks in 1918. they get this pamphlet from their Tsarist allies or their white allies, the white Russian political movement. It's translated into English. It's eventually exposed as a forgery by Alan Dulles, of all people. He writes about this in the Times of London in 1920.
Is that where the Rothschild conspiracy stuff comes from? That pamphlet, that forgery, or is that a different origin?
It reinforces the Rothschild conspiracy theory. The Rothschild stuff is really a 19th century thing, and ironically, it's a combination of anti-Semitism and in this country also Anglophobia. Because there's this kind of, there's this big debate among American historians about whether or not the populist movement in the 19th century was proto-fascistic or, anti-Semitic or whatnot. This goes back to the 50s with people like Richard Hofstadter. One of the reasons why the debate has been robust over the years is that there is a lot of like anti-Rothschild stuff in populist literature that often has anti-Semitic variances, but is often just like Anglophobic. It's like, these London banks are like manipulating commodities prices in the American Midwest or whatever. And that's actually true too. Like that is actually an accurate understanding of how international finance worked in the 19th century. So it's complicated. But anyway, John B. Trevor, after he gets back to the United States, he's assigned to the Manhattan Intelligence District. So he's based in New York City. He actually draws up a plan in, I think it was 1919 or 1920 to suppress a Jewish communist uprising on the Lower East Side. There's actually a well thought out counterinsurgency strategy to suppress like Jewish revolutionaries. So, and Trevor again designs the racial quota system for the 1924 Immigration Act. So yeah, there's the phantasmagorical, like, Judeo-Bolshevik revolutionaries are going to destroy America. And then there's I write it pretty extensively in the book about this guy, Merwin Hart, who is the head of the National Economic Council in the 1930s and 40s, sort of like a right-wing pro-business group. He's a conspiratorial anti-Semite. So he also, eventually subscribes to this like Jewish Bolshevik revolutionaries are out to get us. But he also blames Jews for the New Deal. And and his analysis there is a little bit more, it's still more or less wrong, but it is a little bit more concrete. So on the one hand, there's like, Felix Frankfurter is manipulating Roosevelt behind the scenes, et cetera, et cetera. But he also believes that the Jewish vote in New York and in other major industrial states has been instrumental in cementing the control of New Deal liberals over the federal government. He's not wrong about Jewish voters being an important New Deal voting bloc. That was true of many, many different ethnic groups. But because it's also tied to his sense of, this broader sort of conspiracy theorism. It sort of melds into this, conspiratorial anti-Semitic worldview. I'd also add that, and this is all obviously intermixed with, good old fashioned American white supremacy. I teach a class, or used to teach a class at UVA. I'm probably going to be teaching a new version of it this spring on, the sort of history of the American far right since the end of the Civil War. And one of the questions I always pose to my students there is, well, why is it that we don't have a stab in the back myth developing in the American South after the end of the Civil War? Because you would think that the ingredients would be there. If you read Du Bois, which is now the sort of primary interpretation of the Civil War and Reconstruction among American historians, slavery ends, the Confederacy, the sort of Southern system dissolves. Because of what is essentially one of the greatest labor uprisings in history. You have hundreds of thousands, about millions of enslaved people walking off the plantations, fleeing to Union lines. You could imagine that would be a ready explanation for the defeated South about why they lost. Well, it's like we were stabbed in the back by our the slave revolts. Instead, something else happens. You get the lost cause. And I think that one of the reasons for that, and that tends to be where most of my students land too, is that in order to embrace that narrative, you have to allow for Black political agency and Black political power in ways that, because of the commitment to white supremacy, these guys just were not capable of. If one of the defining aspects of anti-Semitism is a discomfort with Jewish political power in its various different aspects, well, there is a narrative about like how Jews are powerful while also being sort of dispossessed. And so that's, I think, a really important reason why you don't see the stab in the back myth develop in the United States after the Civil War. To bring it forward, though, I think you also, this is also where the explanation for, the Jewish control of the civil rights movement, or the communist control of the civil rights movement, sort of comes in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Because again, you cannot admit, if you are a committed white supremacist, black political agency, because that's just almost by definition not possible. But you do have a framework for understanding Jewish political power and Jewish political agency. And so I think that's where a lot of the conspiracy theories around, again, the Jewish control of the civil rights movement, intermixed with communism.
Fascinating. So that's why when like contemporary conspiracy theories around like brown people being the problem, it's the Jews that brought them in. It's because the brown people themselves couldn't have done it, right? Is that the idea?
Yeah, basically. And you see elements of this in some of the mass shooter manifestos over the past 10 years. I mean, the Christchurch. Yeah. I mean, and it's ironic too, because many of them are anti-Semitic, but make an exception for Zionism, for the state of Israel, because it's not Jewish people per se that are the problem. If they are within their sort of within the Jewish ethno-nationalist state. But it's international Judaism. It's the sort of it's the globalist. It's cosmopolitanism that's the problem. As the Stalinists used to say, it's rootless cosmopolitanism. So, there's a way.
Josh Hawley once said, is it?
Yeah. No, I mean, so there's a way that ethno-nationalism, even Jewish ethno-nationalism, it can be rendered as not just legible, but even legitimate, for people who are otherwise, very deeply committed to conspiratorial anti-Semitism. And you see people like this with, Richard Spencer. I mean, he's been, and he's taken heat from other white nationalists on this point, because he said, I don't have a problem with Zionism per se. Now, of course, there's another way to talk about Zionism on the right, and frankly on the left too, about, international Zionism being a sort of broader conspiracy and exercising power in various different ways. So there is a language for that. And you do see it a lot on the right. This is the sort of origin of the term Zionist occupied government to describe Israeli control over American foreign policy, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But there is this other sort of trend, in sort of how the right thinks about sort of Jewish conspiracy, which and is
the ethno-nationalist part, right? And that's the same reason that like Viktor Orban or these other foreigners, so you would think, America First people wouldn't be in love with foreigners, right? But they actually are, because it reaffirms the nationalism here. There's like just a complementarity there, or that are trying to draw at least this idea of America First and a kind of white nationalist ethos and maybe we can transition to how the history that you track kind of leads us to today, and the kind of, if I have it right, the myth that there is this sharp boundary between the far right, the fascists, the anti-Semites, the racists, and, respectable conservatism, is something I think your book kind of takes head on and shows is misleading and false and needs to be understood differently. But somehow today we have a more obvious far right in ascendance that is not so shy about their white supremacy and all these things, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically the point of the book is that the modern far right and the conservative movement have common origins and by common origins, I mean, they're literally the same people who are, opposed to the New Deal and acting in coalition with each other. I use the framework of the Popular Front. I call it the right-wing Popular Front, to make sense of these relationships. Because one of the things I did not want to do in the book, and I hope I don't think I did, is to, collapse all of these different factions into the same thing and say they're all Nazis, basically. There were Nazis, but they were part of the coalition. So there's the common origin, which blurs a lot of these sort of firm boundaries between, again, quote unquote, responsible and fringe, movements on the right. The people who are, within the sort of conservative self-narrative about, William F. Buckley and others purging the, movement of these radical elements. Well, behind the scenes, they were actually deeply committed to trying to, maintain those relationships and repair those bridges, have some kind of unified, approach on the right, even as they were sort of declaiming that publicly. And then the other thing is that really the origin of the modern white power movement comes out of American conservatism. These are people who feel in the 1960s that American conservatism hasn't gone far enough in sort of defending, in defending the existing racial order. And in particular, it's people who are deeply committed. And again, this is just resonant with my experience with Rufo et al., deeply committed as a first principle of their politics to biological racism. Because there's biological racists are a dime a dozen on the right. I mean, National Review consistently since the 1960s has been one of the major organs for popularizing race IQ research. And I got to tell you, I've been getting a lot of messages. I mean, I've gotten at least 100 emails from various different people over the blow up on Twitter. And that's a consistent theme from the right wingers. It's the race IQ stuff over and over and over again. So there's a deep commitment among quote unquote responsible conservatives to biological racism in that sense. What
makes them responsible is they don't want to be called racists and anti-Semites and so forth. They still espouse those views, but they deny the label, right?
Right. Well, that's exactly it. So, I mean, basically the position of people like William F. Buckley and other sort of prominent conservatives in the 1960s and 70s was to retain the politics. And Buckley was very explicit about this in his debates with James Baldwin, right, in 1965 at Oxford Union. It's to, have the same substantive political commitments, but to make at least titular or at least discursive concessions to the claims of the civil rights movement. So, Buckley says the problem in Alabama in 1965 is not that black people are voting, but too many people are voting, period. Like poor white people shouldn't be able to vote either. So, he has this, I found a letter that Buckley wrote to James J. Kilpatrick, who was the editor of the Richmond News Leader in the 1950s and 60s, one of the architects of massive resistance to desegregation in the state of Virginia, and also contributor to National Review. And he writes to Kilpatrick and he says something to the effect of, I don't doubt that you're right about there being some sort of fundamental difference between the races on a sort of biological level. But that shouldn't matter. We should all treat each other with like Christian charity and brotherhood. So there is at least a kind of like gesture towards universalism. Now, for people who become leaders in what becomes the white power movement, there's none of that. It's like not only are biological differences between the races real, race itself as a category is a meaningful historical agent. So you're getting into almost Nazi territory here already, and is the fundamental basis for how we understand and perceive politics. So it's not just a sort of add-on. It is the central way in which they understand the world. And so for people like that, they become the white power movement. They become the neo-Nazis. They were conservatives first. There's always sort of movement between these two camps. I write about Joseph Braun, who was one of Buckley's proteges at National Review in the 1970s and 80s. I mean, he becomes a neo-Nazi towards the end of his career, explicitly on this basis, because he praises how white nationalists talk about race. He says something to the effect of, he says this in 1983 about this neo-Nazi magazine, Instauration. He writes this in a syndicated column. He says, this is one of the few magazines that has that is brave enough, again, this language of bravery, brave enough to tell the truth about how most white people think about race in America.
That's the end of the first half of the episode. So if you like that, make sure to tune in next week for the second half of our conversation with David Austin Walsh. Thanks for listening, everybody. We will see you then.